Hello, I'm Ryan, and welcome to Analyze This Mr. Bond, my channel where I discuss the adventures of James Bond 007 and dig for what lies beneath the surface. And today we are digging into Thunderball. This is a video I'm making with some trepidation given my feelings about Thunderball, given Thunderball's iconic status in the Bond franchise, and its beloved place in the hearts of Bond fans around the world. Certainly, my father cherished Thunderball. It was arguably his favorite of the Bond films. And when the film released, it was coming off of the momentum of Goldfinger. It was the height of spy mania in the 1960s when Thunderball graced the screen. Obviously, I wasn't there for the tremendous groundswell of enthusiasm that accompanied its release, but I'm here today, and I loved Thunderball growing up, but my attitude towards it has shifted, and now I'm coming to it with fresh eyes, having just seen Goldfinger on the big screen with an audience the way it was meant to be seen. And I have to say, the comparison between Goldfinger and Thunderball really didn't do Thunderball a lot of favors, and that's not necessarily what I expected to occur, but that's definitely how I'm feeling about it in this moment. In fact, I'm going to go as far as to say, just to lay all my cards out on the table, that Thunderball might be my least personal favorite of the Sean Connery Bond films. I'm not going to say it's the worst. I think arguably and almost, almost objectively. Nothing in film evaluation is objective, but Diamonds Are Forever is a more rickety film than Thunderball in a lot of ways, but I think minute by minute, Diamonds Are Forever is actually more entertaining than Thunderball. Though Thunderball has a kind of host of issues, and I think it stems from calibration for the most part. Goldfinger was the product of director Guy Hamilton. Guy Hamilton generally had a fairly comedic leaning when he entered the series. The first two Bond films are pulpy thrillers. They have moments of humor and surrealism, sensationalism. But Guy Hamilton really understood comedy, and all of his Bond films focus on comedy to one degree or another, to the point where Goldfinger, in many ways, feels like it is often a light comedy, a campy farce that uses Sean Connery's star power as its greatest special effect. He's very attentive in his framing of Sean Connery and Goldfinger to Connery's body language, his facial gestures. There's a lot of very powerfully well-used close-ups or framed images of Sean Connery and his body language throughout Goldfinger that I really picked up, especially on the big screen. But there's a sense in which Sean Connery's raw star power is something that Guy Hamilton very specifically tries to channel in Goldfinger. I actually prefer Sean Connery's performance all around in Thunderball. I think he's finding an interesting balance between the more charming, charismatic figure that he cut in Goldfinger with the darker aspects of the character that we saw in the first two films, helmed by Terrence Young. And I really enjoy what Connery himself is doing there. But Terrence Young returning to this feature seems to be lost a little bit in the balance now that Goldfinger came out. It really set the franchise on a new trajectory. And Terrence Young, who is a great director, but is a drier director, he's in many ways a more classically British film director, which is one reason he was very good at evoking the work of Alfred Hitchcock. There's a sort of dry wit about the way Terrence Young directs a movie and kind of builds his sequences that makes him particularly appropriate for thrillers, for scenes of intrigue. When he comes back to Thunderball, the nature of the series has changed, and you see that Thunderball is a much more outrageously silly film, that it is much more invested in gadgets and antics and humor, and some of that is very successful, I think. Thunderball is, on the whole, a sharper movie when it comes to Bond's dialogue, his witticism. Again, Connery delivering those lines with just such clever attention to detail and phrasing. So I think Connery's greatest comedic line in the entire series is after Fiona Volpe's death in Thunderball, when he passes her off in a chair next to a couple at the Kiss Kiss Club and says, "Do you mind if my friend sits this one out? She's just dead." And the facial expressions that Connery has in the transition from his like really goofy grin to this sort of like deadpan severity as he turns away from them is just a testament to how good Connery could be as an actor and how gifted he was at understanding comedy. But Terrence Young doesn't really quite understand how to lean into that in the way that might give a movie as loose and rambling as Thunderball ends up being a centerpiece. Goldfinger is a loose movie. So is From Russia with Love, and in all of these ways, you know, the Connery era, their stories are kind of rambling. They're very episodic. There's a very clear dynamic between the hero and villain in most of these, except for From Russia with Love, which is very complex on that score, and that's one reason that's Terrence Young's best feature. He's very good at building around this kind of maze of shifting intrigue. It's less about characters sitting across the table from one another in the way that it is in Goldfinger. Goldfinger is developing all this energy from scenes where characters are just kind of talking to one another face to face, and you see Guy Hamilton really zero in on the dialogue and interchange between those actors. Terrence Young, in his peak achievement during From Russia with Love, is much more about the shifting dynamics between forces who are often not speaking to one another. They're often just manipulating things from the shadows and kind of navigating those corridors. Thunderball is kind of uneasily caught between both of those. The book Thunderball is a fairly simple, straightforward, fast-moving story, but in the effort to make it an epic that could rival Goldfinger, so much material has been added, so many set pieces have been added, that the story starts to buckle under its own weight a little bit. It's not the only Bond film to be structured in such a way that we, the audience, are privy to the villain's plot before Bond is. Certainly that's how From Russia with Love works. That's how many other films work, including GoldenEye, where we get glimpses of what the villains are doing and Bond has to kind of catch up to our understanding. But the problem with that piece of it in Thunderball is it kind of breaks down on two levels. One, the character work is not really interesting enough to carry that dynamic, and I'll talk about that more in a second. But also, the plot, which in Fleming's novel, again, is very straightforward, almost like lightning fast. It's one reason Thunderball is one of the best beach reads I've ever read, is just how direct it is and how exciting it is and just how it just kind of moves effectively like a bullet, right, from start to finish. That the movie has some good momentum to start with, but it really starts to drag things out as it starts to manufacture situations for Bond to be in confrontation with the villain and be like slowly piecing together what really should be a bit faster, and is much faster in the source material. So I think in many ways that's part of Thunderball's problem. It just doesn't have an energy source in which to plug into in the same way that Goldfinger did, or From Russia with Love. From Russia with Love could plug into the intrigue, the complexities of it, the intricacies of its setting, and the way that helps frame the story. Goldfinger was able to anchor in the fact that Bond had such a strong character relationship with its villain and his henchman and his, female collaborator, this sort of like trio of villainy that Bond is kind of bouncing off of each in turn in very personal ways with each of them, with lots of like back and forth over the course of the story. Thunderball doesn't quite get there, though there are moments of promise along the way. So first and foremost, let's just start at the beginning with Thunderball, because I think the opening of Thunderball is somewhat illustrative of the problem here. I love the way Thunderball actually starts. There's actually this really wonderful opening shot of a coffin with JB on it. Is Bond in the coffin? No, he's watching from above. And you get this sort of simmering tension where we realize that Bond is looking at the casket of a man that he wishes he had killed. But Bond is smart enough to know that this man is not alive. And what follows is this wonderful bait and switch where Bond follows the widow of his enemy and reveals to the audience that the widow is in fact that man in disguise, and a fight happens brutally, and it's actually a very thrilling, rough fight. I love the way it ends with such, a pronounced moment of violence in front of the fireplace, and then Bond just tossing the flowers over his dead body in a moment of almost like mocking irony, right? It's Bond again, establishing himself as the superior alpha dog in the hierarchy of killers. It's such a good stretch up until that moment that feels very rooted in what we've come to love about the way Terrence Young understands Bond. Bond is very debonair, but he's very deadly. There's this moment of tense violence. And it's also kind of Hitchcockian in the way it's using a device here of a man disguised as a woman, and then, Bond having to have that battle with that. It's a sequence that you could kind of see Hitchcock having some fun with in his own surrealist way, in his own, kind of dark humor and the way he viewed situations of violence. But then you kind of get this awkward shift into Goldfinger territory immediately after that is much less successful than most of the things in Goldfinger, with Bond donning a jetpack for no real reason at all. It's so horrendously impractical. It's not really particularly good spectacle the way it's filmed. I mean, it's always cool to know, like when you're watching it, that it is in fact a real jetpack, and that still makes the image of it cool and iconic in its own way. But it's narratively unsatisfying and dramatically unsatisfying, especially as a climax for this sequence, and it kind of betrays the tone of what's been established thus far. And then, as if to, underline that this is really about, making sure that we're connecting this back to Goldfinger, we once again see the Aston Martin and its gadgetry, and for whatever reason, they end the pre-title sequence on oil slick being spilled onto hapless goons. And it's a very odd transition into the title sequence for me. I'm not particularly fond of how that whole pre-title sequence kind of segs into the title sequence. I love the Tom Jones song. I think it actually picks up very well from where Goldfinger left off in terms of tone, style, feeling of the era, John Barry's score kind of capturing it. It's not quite the song that Goldfinger is, but it feels like they really did their best to create an iconic anthem for the movie that really could match the scale of what they were trying to do, which was a true Bond epic. And we then get kind of introduced to this interesting chapter, which I like very much, where Bond is at the clinic in Shrublands and starts to piece together this scheme that unfolds in real time. GoldenEye will later do a kind of version of this formula when it has Bond in Monaco and Xenia on the top. Here, Bond's in Shrublands, kind of in the midst of a plot that he doesn't know he's in, picking up pieces of a greater scheme. And I think Connery is really, as much as I've said Terrence Young doesn't really fully channel his energy here, Connery is just so good here. This is his most comfortable, assured performance as Bond. There's nothing, no sign of effort about it, but he's so at ease, so assured. He's wearing the best wardrobe he has in any of the Bond films. It's just so wonderfully varied, so stylish. Um, the only thing we could quibble about is maybe his hairpiece, which looks rather sad in a few different moments in the movie. But he looks great, and he's delivering dialogue beautifully. And this stretch of the movie gives him a lot to do, with a lot of interplay with different characters, kind of in his own rascal, roguish way. Once again, we see, that he is an emblem of, let's say, a somewhat archaic view of masculinity in the way that, he imposes himself on Patricia at the clinic and things like that. But in general, it's easy to see, like, this as the encapsulation of everything we associate with Connery Bond. It captures both the darker facets of the character from prior films and his movie starness from Goldfinger, and mostly reconciles it, at least as far as Connery is concerned. I think the movie mostly works up until we start to get into the story with Domino and Largo. Largo, Fleming didn't give the production team that much to work with. Largo is not an interesting character in Fleming's novel, and he's just kind of an okay character here, especially coming after, a character who has as much crackling byplay with Bond as Goldfinger does in Goldfinger. They kind of missed the mark here a little bit, because Largo is potentially a very intelligent villain and a really good foil to Bond. And I think we will eventually get to talking about Never Say Never Again, but I think the one aspect in which Never Say Never Again is unequivocally superior to Thunderball is in the casting of Largo. Never Say Never Again's Largo is so much more interesting and dynamic a creation than the Largo of Thunderball. And I think that weighs down the movie a little bit, but what really weighs the movie down is that it abandons so much of what made Domino one of Fleming's best Bond girls. She's such a wonderfully rich, dynamic, firebrand character in the novel. And Bond and Domino's relationship is both very tender and fiery, and she's a force to be reckoned with in the novel. And here, as beautiful as she is, Claudine Auger is just one of the most stunning people. She just can't really center the film in terms of dramatic relationship in the way that you would really like. And the final climactic payoff of her taking out Largo could have so much weight if the story had really built it up. But her character feels fairly lightweight. She pops in and out of the story, but so much of the heft of that character from the novel is gone. And if you haven't read the novel, I recommend you do. She has a wonderful chapter in the novel. It's called Cardboard Hero, where she and Bond are at Cafe Martinique, and they're having their dinner conversation. That is one of the great unused sections of Fleming dialogue that I would love to see repurposed in a film adaptation at some point, because it's such a good character moment for her. But I will say, there's such a lovely, glamorous ambiance to this movie. Nassau is presented in such a beautiful, lively way. I do love the way that Bond and Domino meet underwater, and it's showcasing the gorgeous reef territory out there. I love the way, in general, that it incorporates things like the Junkanoo. I don't think the use of Nassau quite reaches the levels of the wonderful setting that we get in From Russia with Love, but that's just because From Russia with Love is much more tied into local politics than the story of Thunderball is. Thunderball is very much uh, a global story that just happens to be located in Nassau, and there's a lot that's done well with Nassau in terms of incorporating the shark life and the diving scenes throughout, and they make most so much of the local scenery. It's no surprise that so many Bond fans have made pilgrimages to these locations because they're quite stunning, and in many ways, the Caribbean is the default Bond location, at least as far as the character classically is concerned, right? Um, so I think there's a lot of beauty in that. In fact, I wanted to give Terrence Young credit for one of my favorite shots in the entire series that he and his I can't remember who the cinematographer was on Thunderball. I apologize, but that is conceived when Bond is arriving by boat at Cafe Martinique, where he's going to gamble with Largo and then later dance with Domino and have a conversation with her there. There's this wonderful shot from that just is like from the perspective of the front of the boat, just showing it pulling into the dock with the lights of the cafe. It's so gorgeous. It's everything you want from Bondian glamour. And in general, I think that sort of ambiance is why Bond fans really anchor into it, alongside some of the very iconic moments. Bond uh, getting thrown into a shark pool, Bond doing cards with the villain back and forth in a very classic, you know, parodyable way. You know, certainly Austin Powers has its fun with that exact scene. Um, the Bond using the spear gun on Vargas. There's so many like lovely touches like that. Fiona Volpe meeting her end at the Kiss Kiss Club. There are a lot of lovely stretches like that. But for every piece like that, there's just kind of like ambling things that don't feel as great. Like Bond and Felix just kind of arbitrarily scanning the shore from a helicopter, kind of eating up screen time, or Fiona Volpe driving Bond very fast and making him kind of nervous, kind of not, on the back roads. It just kind of feels like it's eating time. There's so much like that's just kind of, I hate to say it, just a slightly dead weight in places in Thunderball, and I feel like that's a problem that sometimes fits the underwater scenes, which are visually spectacular but lack what a really good set piece has, which is film is essentially all about rhythm. Editing is the primary tool of cinema, the idea that you can cut between one image and another, and those images can have different durations, right? A great action sequence is all about rhythm building up to a clear climax and pulling away. And Peter Hunt is a great editor, but the problem is with a lot of the underwater footage, it's very clear that they weren't quite able to stage it in a way that builds, to clear dramatic moments. It's no surprise that the grand climax of Thunderball picks up a little bit once Bond gets on the boat. The stuff underwater is visually spectacular, but it happens at a slow pace, and it's very hard for them to build lots of little moments that kind of add up to this rise and fall of like a roller coaster as you get to the big payoffs of that sequence. And that happens throughout the movie. So I feel like in general the movie suffers from that a little bit, with just lots of little moments that aren't quite fully developed in terms of the rise and fall of a thriller moment. But I do want to say the one addition to Fleming's story that is absolutely excellent is Fiona Volpe. Fiona Volpe is the great femme fatale of the Bond series, and it's hard to find anyone who quite matches her up until maybe Xenia Onatopp in Goldeneye. I mean, she's such a wonderful force to be reckoned with. She is more charismatic than Largo. In fact, the film comes alive when she's really on the screen. So, you almost wish they had leaned into her more and kind of compressed some of the stuff around her to just give her more showtime. Because the sequence where she and seduces Bond and then captures him and takes him to the Junkanoo and climaxing up with her death is particularly great. It's everything that you kind of want Bondian fantasy to be, or at least I do, and it works so well. I think it's pieces like that that I can see why Bond fans find Thunderball so thrilling. But the problem is, especially coming off of the back of watching From Russia with Love and Goldfinger before it, it just doesn't feel as coherent. It doesn't feel as tight. It doesn't feel as well judged in terms of how anything is leading to the next. There's just a lot of like, this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens, without there being real development in the character relationships the way there was in Goldfinger, or real development in the character dynamics the way it was in From Russia with Love. Bond is doing a lot of cat and mouse games with Largo and his hench people, but the dynamic doesn't really shift all that much from the time Bond is like openly confronting Largo at the card table to the point at the end. It's just kind of a lot of like very, half-hearted stops along the way. And I think the challenge there is a lot of the set pieces that then occur. Some of them are grander than others, but a lot of them are a little bit, they just don't quite connect on the character level that I'm looking for, or the narrative level that I'm looking for. They're great in isolation. I love the idea of Bond being in a shark pool. I love Bond being chased through the Junkanoo. I love those pieces, but I think the character moments in this just don't quite click. Like, for example, when Bond goes to Palmyra and has lunch with Largo and is shown around his estate, and there's the wonderful interplay with Bond, quipping about how well he can shoot versus, Largo. And I know a little about women. Like that kind of dynamic. Connery is very good there, but there's not a real sense of those scenes coming alive on the whole. It's not like you think about it and remember Largo's dialogue in those. It's more like you're just waiting for Bond to jump in and have a good moment that kind of fills in your memory of the rest of the scene. Whereas in Goldfinger, Honor Blackman and is able to really banter back and forth with Bond. In fact, and it's not just Pussy Galore and Odd Job and Goldfinger that are giving Bond a run for his money. Even someone like Jill Masterson has some great interplay with them and just their short scene together that really crackles. And I don't feel the sort of like tight precision around this in this movie. There's a sense in which this movie has the shadow of something that's really, really special in it. That's something that's better, I think, than Goldfinger, because I think if you really had stuck more to the framework of Fleming's novel, you have a narrative that I think could have really been a real barrel of tension from start to finish if you really kept with the momentum of it. But it's not quite there. It's just very slack and loose, and you kind of feel the dead ends, like the henchman coming into Bond's hotel room and Bond sending him back to Largo. It's just kind of like a weird, brief detour. And some of Bond films are sometimes made of those brief detours, don't get me wrong, especially with the Roger Moore era, where it's just kind of like set piece after set piece after set piece. But the thing is, in those movies know they're just set piece factories. Every set piece is almost a mini movie unto themselves, and you're just kind of moving on to the next one, especially when you're talking about something like Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker. Thunderball doesn't quite get there. It's just kind of uneasily, awkwardly in the middle. But the one aspect of this movie that I want to say is absolutely special is John Barry's score. I think Barry's score for Thunderball is actually pretty underrated. It has this wonderful, dark, sort of sinister vibe that accompanies well this sort of ominous sense of Spectre as an organization, really coming to the forefront of the international stage for the first time. Barry's soundscape I don't know, it really captures the sort of uncanny qualities of being underwater. So I just want to give him all the credit in the world. I think, and this is also one of the rare Bond movies that has really like fully developed double themes, essentially because they replaced the main theme of the movie at the last minute with the Tom Jones theme. It was originally going to be Mr. Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, and the whole score is kind of largely built around that. And then you have sections of Thunderball instrumentally that they layered in after they decided to pivot to it. But that blend of themes actually works really well. I also want to talk about a little bit about how this develops the Spectre story. And so Bond has faced off against Spectre twice before in Doctor No and From Russia with Love. And here Spectre is broadened out to be almost a sinister corporation. And Bond is going up against this dark, sinister corporate enemy, the dark side of industrialization, essentially. This rogue power that is going to hold the world at bay by stealing nuclear weapons. I think it's an interesting shift in dynamic from something that expands nicely on what we learn about the organization in Doctor No. They seem like they're a corporate body, and it's great to see Ken Adam design their meeting room in a way that is just so soulless and industrial and corporate. It's so different from the way, for example, Sam Mendes and team envision how Spectre would meet in the film of the same name, where it's much more gothic and macabre. Here, it's soulless and industrial, and you get the sense that they are the force of the modern world. And it's kind of interesting to see Bond as this sort of rogue killer representing the old world, kind of holding them at bay, this sort of dehumanizing criminal institution run by thugs and bullies. It's an interesting thread to pick that up when we get into You Only Live Twice, because I think, and especially Diamonds Are Forever, which carries forward that idea in essentially Spectre remaining the sort of force that works in the industrial world at large to achieve its aims. So I've talked for long enough. I'm looking at the counter here, and I'm around 32 minutes here. So I always try to keep these around this length. So I'll wrap up my video here, though I have probably more to say about Thunderball in my heart. Let me know what you think about Thunderball. I know already many of you love it, so feel free to come for me in the comments. I invite your disagreement with me, and I'm happy to have share words back and forth down in the comments. And I will happily catch you all in the next one.